In the winter of 1943, in the industrial heart of occupied Poland, there stood a textile factory that never stopped working. Day and night, the looms clattered, the machines hummed, and workers moved through the shadows under the watchful eyes of German overseers. The factory produced fabric for the Reich, uniforms, blankets, anything the war machine demanded. But hidden within its walls was something the Nazis never discovered, a secret world behind a blue-painted door. This door wasn't remarkable. It blended perfectly with the machinery around it, the same shade of industrial blue, covered in the same layer of factory dust, marked with the same faded production numbers. To anyone walking past, it was just another part of the equipment, another panel in an endless maze of metal and wood. But behind that door, in a space no wider than a single room, 56 children lived in absolute silence. For 9 months, these children existed in a world measured by the rhythm of factory machinery. They learned to breathe quietly, to move without sound, to sleep through the deafening noise that both imprisoned and protected them. They were ghosts in a functioning factory, invisible lives sustained by courage, desperation, and extraordinary ingenuity. This is the story of Operation Bluegate, one of the most daring civilian rescue operations of World War II. It's a story that almost disappeared with the children it saved, preserved only through whispered testimonies and a set of smuggled blueprints that revealed the impossible. How did 56 children survive for 9 months in the heart of a working factory? How did they remain undiscovered through countless inspections, through illness, through the crushing weight of fear? And what happened when the Germans ordered a complete inspection of the factory in the spring of 1944? The answers lie behind a door that no longer exists, in a space that was deliberately erased from history. But the children who emerged from that darkness never forgot, and neither should we. To understand the miracle of Bluegate, you must first understand what Łódź had become by 1943. Before the war, this was Poland's second-largest city, a thriving center of textile production, known as the Polish Manchester. Its factories had made it wealthy. Its Jewish community, more than 200,000 people, had made it vibrant, diverse, alive. The Germans arrived in September 1939, and within months, they transformed Łódź into Litzmannstadt, a German city with a very specific purpose. The Jewish population was forced into a sealed ghetto, one of the largest in occupied Europe. And unlike other ghettos, this one was designed to be productive. The Nazis wanted to extract every possible ounce of labor before carrying out their final solution. So the ghetto became a factory complex. Men, women, and even children worked 16-hour shifts producing goods for the Wehrmacht. They sewed uniforms, assembled equipment, processed materials, all while starving, all while watching their communities slowly disintegrate. The Germans calculated everything with brutal precision. Just enough food to keep workers alive, just enough fear to maintain control, just enough hope to prevent uprising. But by 1943, even that grim arrangement was ending. The deportations intensified. Trains arrived regularly at the raid gas station, and thousands were shipped to Chelmno and Auschwitz. The Germans called it resettlement. Everyone knew what it really meant. The ghetto was being liquidated, systematically emptied, and the most vulnerable were taken first: the elderly, the sick, and the children. For Jewish children in Łódź, there was no safety. They couldn't hide in plain sight. They couldn't pass as Polish. The ghetto walls trapped them, and beyond those walls, the city offered no sanctuary. Most Polish civilians were too terrified to help, and German patrols were everywhere. Schools had been closed. Playgrounds were forbidden. Childhood itself had been criminalized. Every child was living on borrowed time, counting down to a selection they couldn't escape. That's when Jan Rosicki made his decision. A former engineer who had worked in Łódź's textile industry before the war, he'd been conscripted to oversee production at one of the remaining factories. He saw the deportations. He heard the whispers about what happened to the children. And he realized that his knowledge of factory architecture, the crawl spaces, the storage areas, the forgotten corners that even the German inspectors ignored, might be the only thing standing between 56 children and oblivion. He would build them a hiding place. Not in a basement or an attic, not in some abandoned building on the edge of town. He would hide them in the last place anyone would think to look, inside a functioning factory, in the middle of the industrial district, surrounded by German supervisors and Polish collaborators. It was audacious. It was probably impossible, but it was their only chance. Jan Rositzky wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He wasn't a resistance fighter or a political activist. Before the war, he'd been an engineer, a quiet, methodical man who specialized in industrial design. He understood factories the way a ship captain understands the sea. Every pipe, every beam, every unused corner had meaning. He could look at a building's blueprints and see not just what was there, but what could be hidden. When the Germans took control of Łódź's textile industry, they needed people who understood the machinery, who could keep production running smoothly. Rositzky was too valuable to send to a labor camp, so they put him to work managing one of the larger factories in the industrial district. On paper, he was a collaborator, ensuring that Polish labor produced German uniforms. In reality, he was planning something that would have gotten him shot immediately if discovered. The idea came to him gradually. He'd been watching the deportations, seeing children pulled from their families and loaded onto trains. He'd heard the rumors about Chelmno, about what happened in those forests north of the city. And he kept thinking about the factory, about all that space, all those rooms, all those corners that the German inspectors walked past every day without really seeing. What if, he thought, you could hide people not by making them invisible, but by making them irrelevant? What if you could construct a space that looked so ordinary, so purposeless, that no one would think to check it? He started making notes. The factory had dozens of storage rooms, most of them connected by old service corridors left over from earlier expansions. There were ventilation ducts running through the walls, originally designed to keep machinery from overheating. There were layers of soundproofing between the production floor and the administrative offices, thick material designed to muffle the constant noise of the looms. If you knew where to look, if you understood the building's skeleton, you could see the possibility, a hidden chamber, large enough to hold dozens of people, accessible through a single disguised entrance. But seeing the possibility wasn't enough. Rositzky needed help. People he could trust absolutely, because one informant would doom everyone. He reached out quietly to a handful of factory workers, men and women he'd known before the war, people whose hatred of the occupation ran deep enough to risk everything. Together, they began to plan Operation Blue Gate. The name came from the entrance itself. There was a door in the northwest corner of the main production floor, painted the same industrial blue as all the machinery. It led to what appeared to be a shallow storage closet, maybe 3 meters deep, filled with broken equipment and old textile samples. Exactly the kind of space that accumulated in factories over decades. No one paid attention to it. Inspectors had checked it once, early in the occupation, and found nothing worth confiscating. Rositzky's plan was to build behind that door. He would construct a false wall at the back of the closet, leaving just enough junk in front to maintain the illusion. Behind the false wall, using materials salvaged from factory waste, he would create a hidden chamber, not elaborate, not comfortable, but survivable. The entrance would remain the blue door, which would be left unlocked, appearing so ordinary that no one would think to look behind the storage clutter. It would take 2 months of careful work, done only during night shifts when German supervision was minimal. It would require absolute secrecy, and it would demand that 56 children learn to live in silence, in darkness, trusting their lives to the sound of factory machines. Rositzky had spent his career building things designed to last for decades. Now he was building something designed to last just long enough for the war to end, or for everyone inside to be discovered. He knew the odds. He knew what failure would mean. But he also knew that doing nothing was a certainty, not a risk. So he measured the spaces, calculated the ventilation, and began to build a world behind a blue-painted door. The construction of the hidden chambers began in November 1943, during the night shifts when German supervisors left the factory floor. Every detail had to be perfect, not just functional, but invisible. Rositzky knew that German inspections were random but thorough, and one architectural inconsistency, one misplaced board, one unexplained smell or sound could unravel everything. The blue door itself required no modification. That was crucial. Rositzky wanted inspectors to open it, see the shallow storage closet they expected, and move on. So the first 3 meters behind the door remained exactly as they'd always been, a cramped space filled with broken loom parts, dusty fabric samples, and old maintenance tools. It looked like every other forgotten corner in the factory, purposeless, cluttered, abandoned. But at the back of that closet, Rosicki and his team built a false wall. They used salvaged wood from packing crates, material that wouldn't be missed from inventory. They aged it deliberately, rubbing dirt into the boards, matching the color to the existing walls. They even transferred some of the factory dust and cobwebs to make it look decades old. To anyone glancing inside, it appeared to be the back wall of a shallow storage space. In reality, it was a door, one that could be lifted out from inside, revealing a corridor that extended deep into the building's core. Behind that false wall was a chamber roughly 20 meters long and 4 meters wide, about the size of a large classroom. Rosicki had found the space by studying the factory's original blueprints and comparing them to the current layout. Decades earlier, during an expansion, this area had been enclosed as part of a new wall, creating a gap between the old exterior and the new structure. It had been sealed off and forgotten, appearing on no recent plans. It was an architectural ghost, a space that existed but wasn't supposed to. Ventilation was the most critical challenge. 56 children breathing in a sealed chamber would quickly exhaust the oxygen and create heat signatures that might be detected. Rosicki solved this by connecting the hidden chamber to the factory's industrial ventilation system. He ran narrow ducts through the walls, disguised as part of the existing air circulation network that cooled the machinery. Air flowed in constantly, stale air flowed out, mixing with the factory's regular exhaust. To anyone monitoring the ventilation, it looked like normal machine cooling. In reality, it was keeping children alive. Sound was the second challenge. The factory operated around the clock, and the constant noise of looms and machinery was actually an advantage. It would mask any sounds from the hidden chamber. But during night shifts, when production slowed, any noise could be catastrophic. Rosicki lined the chamber's walls with layers of textile waste, thick, sound-dampening fabric that the factory produced in abundance. He hung it in multiple layers, creating what was essentially an acoustic buffer. It made the space feel smaller, more oppressive, but it meant that even a crying child wouldn't be heard from outside. The entrance protocol was carefully designed. The blue door was never locked. That would draw attention. Instead, it remained slightly ajar, looking permanently unimportant. When children needed to enter or exit, it happened only during shift changes, when the factory floor was chaotic with workers moving between stations. A child would slip through the blue door, move the junk aside, lift the false wall, and disappear into the corridor, all in less than 30 seconds. To anyone watching casually, it looked like someone retrieving stored materials. Inside the hidden chamber, Rosicki created the minimum infrastructure for survival. There were no beds. Children slept on layers of fabric directly on the floor. There were no toilets. They used buckets that were emptied during night shifts and camouflaged among factory waste. There was no natural light. The chamber existed in permanent darkness, illuminated only by a single shielded candle during evening hours when the factory noise was loudest. Food came in gradually, smuggled by workers during their shifts. A piece of bread hidden in a tool bag, a jar of preserves wrapped in work rags, vegetables smuggled in pockets. It was never enough. The children lived in a state of constant semi-starvation, their rations calculated to keep them alive but quiet. Hunger, Rosicki had grimly noted, kept children lethargic and less likely to make noise. By December 1943, the chamber was complete. The false wall was in place. The ventilation was functioning. The entrance was perfected. All that remained was the most dangerous part, bringing the children inside, one by one, and teaching them to live in absolute silence. Rosicki had built a sanctuary. Now he had to fill it with ghosts. Imagine being 7 years old and being told that your survival depends on never making a sound, that you must live in darkness, surrounded by strangers, where even a whisper could mean death. This was the reality for the 56 children hidden behind the blue gate, a reality that lasted 9 months. The children ranged in age from 4 to 14. They came from families scattered across the Łódź ghetto, selected not randomly, but strategically. Rosicki and his network prioritized children who were scheduled for deportation, children whose families had already been taken, children who had nowhere else to go. Each child was brought in separately, usually at night, smuggled through the chaos of the factory district, and slipped through the blue door during shift changes. Their first sight of the hidden chamber must have been terrifying. After months or years living in the ghetto's crowded, violent anxiety, they entered a space that was even more claustrophobic, completely dark, and silent except for the muffled thunder of machines beyond the walls. There were no windows, no sense of time, no connection to the outside world. Just fabric-lined walls, dim candlelight during evening hours, and the constant, rhythmic pounding of the factory that would become the soundtrack of their existence. The children quickly learned the rules that were absolute, non-negotiable, a matter of life and death. Never speak above a whisper during day shifts when inspections could happen. Never move during silent periods. Never cry, never shout, never laugh out loud. Learn the factory's rhythm. When the machines were loudest, you had brief moments of relative freedom. When production slowed, you became a statue. The older children helped the younger ones understand. Those who couldn't adapt, and there were some, were quietly sedated with what little medicine the resistance could smuggle in. Daily life was structured around survival, not living. The children woke when they heard the morning shift begin, the machinery roaring to life beyond the walls. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was distributed by a rotating group of factory workers who had been brought into the secret. A piece of bread per child, sometimes with a smear of ersatz jam. Water, carefully rationed. On good days, a thin soup made from vegetable scraps. On bad days, nothing but bread. During daylight hours, when the factory was most active and German supervisors were present, the children stayed completely still. They sat against the fabric walls, some sleeping, some staring into darkness, some holding hands with siblings or friends they'd found in the hiding place. The older children were taught to monitor the younger ones, to notice signs of illness or distress before they became loud. One sick child coughing at the wrong moment could doom everyone. Education happened in whispers. A former teacher named Mrs. Kaminska, who'd been smuggled into the chamber as a caretaker, conducted lessons in absolute silence. She would mouth words, use hand gestures, write with her finger on children's palms. She taught them mathematics by having them count on their fingers, history through silent storytelling, Polish literature through barely audible recitations. The children learned to read lips, to communicate through gestures, to turn education itself into a survival skill. The evening hours, when production peaked and the factory noise was loudest, offered brief respite. This was when the children could whisper to each other, when Mrs. Kaminska could read to them in a low voice, when they could move around the chamber without fear of being heard. These hours became precious, a few moments when they could remember what it felt like to be children. They played silent games, charades, finger puzzles, drawing pictures in the dust. They told each other stories about what they'd do after the war, where they'd go, what they'd eat. Hope, even in that darkness, refused to die completely. The hardest times were the inspections. The children could hear them. Boots on the factory floor, German voices barking orders, the sound of doors being opened and closed. During these moments, the chamber became a tomb. Every child froze. Some held their breath. The older ones covered the mouths of the younger ones, not cruelly, but necessarily. They could hear the blue door being opened, hear inspectors rummaging through the storage junk just meters away from their false wall. And they waited, hearts pounding, knowing that one cough, one sneeze, one involuntary sound would be the end. There were close calls. Once, a 4-year-old girl developed a fever and began crying uncontrollably during a routine inspection. Mrs. Kaminska had to press a cloth over the child's mouth, muffling her sobs while 3 German officers stood on the other side of the false wall, discussing production quotas. The inspection lasted 7 minutes. To everyone in the chamber, it felt like hours. Another time, a boy accidentally knocked over a bucket during a night shift, the metallic clang echoing through the corridor. Workers on the floor immediately began dropping tools, creating a cacophony of noise to cover the mistake. A German supervisor investigated, found nothing, attributed it to clumsy Polish workers. The boy was 9 years old. He didn't make another sound for weeks. This was daily life behind the blue gate, an existence measured in held breaths, in silence, in the crushing weight of fear. The children didn't play. They didn't laugh. They didn't live in any normal sense. They survived, and they memorized the rhythm of the looms, learning to distinguish the sounds that meant safety from the sounds that meant danger. In that darkness, Those rhythms became their clock, their calendar, their entire world. And for 9 months, against every odd, it was enough. In 9 months of operation, Blue Gate survived 7 major inspections, dozens of random searches, and one catastrophic moment that nearly exposed everyone. Each close call revealed both the fragility of Rosicki's design and the desperate courage of everyone involved. The first serious inspection came in January 1944, barely a month after the last children had been moved into the chamber. A new German officer had been assigned to oversee factory production, a meticulous bureaucrat named Hauptmann Wolf who believed that efficiency came from knowing every centimeter of his domain. He announced a complete facility audit. Every room would be measured, every storage space cataloged, every inconsistency investigated. Rosicki received word of the inspection 3 days in advance. He immediately gathered his inner circle, the 5 workers who knew about Blue Gate, and they made a grim calculation. The blue door would definitely be opened. The storage closet would be examined. If Wolf was as thorough as his reputation suggested, he might even measure the room and compare it to the blueprints. If he did that, if he noticed that the closet seemed shallower than the building's exterior wall would suggest, he would start asking questions that had no good answers. They decided on a desperate gambit. Rosicki intentionally created a minor problem in a different part of the factory. He sabotaged a loom in a distant wing, causing enough damage to require immediate attention, but not so much that it looked like sabotage. When Wolf arrived to begin his inspection, Rosicki personally escorted him through the facility, carefully managing the route. He saved the blue door storage closet for late in the day, after hours of tedious measurements, after Wolf was already exhausted and impatient. And when they reached it, Rosicki opened the door, gestured at the cluttered space, and immediately began asking Wolf's advice about the broken loom in the other wing. The distraction worked. Wolf glanced into the storage closet, saw exactly what he expected to see, forgotten junk in a forgotten corner, and moved on. He never measured it. He never compared it to the blueprints. The inspection continued for 2 more hours, but the blue door had been cleared. Inside the hidden chamber, 56 children had spent 4 hours in absolute silence, barely breathing, while a Nazi officer stood meters away, deciding their fate without knowing they existed. The second close call was medical. In March, a boy named David, 12 years old, one of the older children, developed appendicitis. The symptoms came on suddenly: severe abdominal pain, fever, vomiting. In any normal circumstance, it would have meant emergency surgery. Behind the blue gate, it meant a choice between risking exposure by taking him to a hospital or letting him die quietly in the dark. Mrs. Kaminska made a desperate decision. She sent word through the network to a Jewish doctor still working in the ghetto's hospital, a man named Dr. Eisenberg who had performed hundreds of surgeries under impossible conditions. She asked if he could operate inside the hidden chamber, without anesthesia beyond what little vodka they could smuggle in, without proper instruments, without any of the tools that make surgery survivable. Dr. Eisenberg came at night. He was smuggled into the factory, guided through the blue door, and confronted with the impossible, a boy in agony, surrounded by terrified children, in a space lit by 3 candles. He had a scalpel, some stolen sutures, bottles of homemade disinfectant, and his experience. The operation took 40 minutes. David was held down by older children while Dr. Eisenberg cut, removed the infected appendix, and stitched him back together. The boy didn't scream. He'd been taught too well, but his muffled sobs were the loudest sound the chamber had ever heard. Miraculously, David survived. The infection didn't spread, the wound healed, and within weeks he was back to the grim routine of silence and waiting. But the incident revealed how precarious everything was. One medical emergency had nearly doomed everyone. The chamber wasn't just a hiding place. It was a trap, and illness could spring it at any moment. The worst close call came in April 1944, when the entire operation nearly collapsed because of something no one could control: a child's instinct. One of the youngest girls in the chamber, a 4-year-old named Sarah, had been separated from her mother weeks earlier. She'd been coping as well as anyone could expect, but the strain was breaking her. One afternoon, during a routine shift, she suddenly bolted. She somehow pushed aside the false wall, ran through the storage closet, threw open the blue door, and stumbled onto the factory floor, crying for her mother. The timing was catastrophic. It was mid-afternoon. German supervisors were present. Workers froze, staring at this filthy, malnourished child who had appeared from nowhere. For 5 seconds, nobody moved. Then Rositzky acted. He ran towards Sarah, scooped her up, and began shouting in German, improvising wildly, claiming she was the daughter of one of the workers, that she'd sneaked into the factory looking for her father, that this was a disciplinary matter he would handle immediately. He carried her back toward the blue door, still talking, still making excuses. A German supervisor followed him. Rositzky's heart was pounding so hard he thought it would burst. He carried Sarah into the storage closet, talking the entire time, blocking the supervisor's view with his body. He set her down among the junk, still talking, creating a narrative out of desperation. And then, somehow, he convinced the supervisor that this was just a minor incident, a foolish child and a negligent parent, nothing worth reporting. The supervisor left. Rositzky waited until he was gone, then carefully replaced the false wall with Sarah back inside, her face buried in Mrs. Kaminska's shoulder. That night, the network met and made a terrible calculation. Sarah had nearly exposed everyone. She was too young, too traumatized, too unpredictable. Some argued she should be removed, taken somewhere else, sacrificed if necessary to protect the others. But Mrs. Kaminska refused. She took personal responsibility for Sarah, promising that the girl would never be loose again, that she would hold her every moment if necessary. Sarah stayed, and for the remaining months of hiding, Mrs. Kaminska kept her promise. The girl was never more than an arm's length away, never left to her own instincts, never given the chance to endanger anyone again. It was a kindness that looked like imprisonment. But in that place, in that time, it was the only way to save her. These close calls weren't anomalies. They were the texture of daily existence behind the blue gate, a constant state of narrowly avoided catastrophe, where survival was measured not in years or months, but in minutes, in held breaths, in split-second decisions made by ordinary people under impossible pressure. The fact that the operation survived for 9 months wasn't a testament to perfect planning. It was a testament to desperate improvisation, extraordinary luck, and the willingness of people like Rositzky, Mrs. Kaminska, and Dr. Eisenberg to risk everything for children they barely knew. January 19, 1945. The sound of artillery had been growing closer for days, a distant thunder that the children behind the blue gate could hear even through the factory walls. The Soviet offensive was approaching Łódź, and everyone, German occupiers, Polish workers, and 56 hidden children, knew that the end was coming, one way or another. The Germans had begun evacuating the factory. Machinery was being dismantled, documents burned, anything valuable loaded onto trucks heading west. German supervisors were abandoning their posts, fleeing before the Red Army arrived. The factory, which had operated continuously for 5 years, was finally going silent. And in that silence, the children faced a new kind of danger. Rositzky gathered his network for one final meeting. The question was simple but agonizing. When do we bring the children out? Bring them out too early, and retreating Germans might discover them. Wait too long, and artillery could destroy the factory with everyone still inside. There were reports of German units massacring witnesses as they retreated, burning buildings to erase evidence. The liberation they'd waited for could easily become their tomb. Rositzky decided to wait for the artillery to stop. On January 19th, the Soviet bombardment of the industrial district intensified, then suddenly ceased. Hours passed in eerie quiet. Then came new sounds, Russian voices, vehicles moving through the streets, the unmistakable accent of Soviet soldiers. The Red Army had entered Łódź. That night, for the first time in 9 months, Rositzky opened the blue door without fear. He lifted away the false wall, and he called into the darkness, "It's over. You can come out now." The children didn't move at first. They'd spent so long in silence, so long learning to distrust any change, that even liberation felt like a trap. Mrs. Kaminska had to coax them, one by one, guiding them through the corridor, through the storage closet, through the blue door that had been their entire world. They emerged onto the factory floor blinking, filthy, malnourished, some of them barely able to walk after months of confinement. 56 children had entered the hidden chamber. 54 walked out. 2 had died during the hiding, one from illness, one in his sleep from causes that Mrs. Kaminska could never determine. Their bodies had been removed quietly during night shifts and buried in unmarked graves outside the city. But 54 had survived the impossible. The children stepped outside for the first time since 1943. It was winter, bitterly cold, and the city around them was unrecognizable, buildings destroyed, streets empty, the ghetto liquidated months earlier. Most of the children had no idea if their families had survived. Some were orphans, their parents deported and murdered while they hid behind the Blue Gate. Others would spend years searching for relatives scattered across Europe. Soviet soldiers found them wandering the factory district and initially didn't believe their story. How could 56 children have survived in the heart of the Nazi occupation? Where had they been hiding? Rositsky brought the soldiers back to the factory, showed them the blue door, demonstrated how the false wall lifted away. The soldiers were stunned. They photographed the chamber, interviewed Rositsky, promised that his story would be documented. Then they moved on. The war was still being fought. There were more urgent priorities than recording one miraculous rescue. In the chaos of liberation, the factory changed hands multiple times. The Soviet authorities took control, then Polish administrators, then various industrial committees. The building had been damaged by artillery, needed repairs, needed reorganization. Decisions were made about renovation, about modernization, about removing old structures that no longer served any purpose. The false wall was dismantled almost immediately. It was in the way, architecturally confusing, not part of any official plans. The blue door was repainted during a factory-wide renovation in 1946. The hidden chamber, that narrow space between walls where 56 children had lived, was eventually filled in during an expansion in 1952. The ventilation ducts were rerouted. The fabric soundproofing was removed. Every physical trace of Blue Gate was erased, not maliciously but indifferently, by people who had no idea what had happened there. Rositsky tried to preserve the space. He submitted requests to historical societies, wrote letters to government officials, argued that the chamber should be preserved as a memorial. But Poland in the late 1940s was focused on rebuilding, on moving forward, not on memorializing the past. His requests were denied or simply ignored. By 1950, even Rositsky couldn't locate exactly where the chamber had been. The renovations had so thoroughly altered the building's interior. The children scattered. Some emigrated to Israel, others to America, a few stayed in Poland. They carried with them the memory of 9 months in darkness, of Mrs. Kaminska's whispered lessons, of the rhythm of factory machinery that had both imprisoned and protected them. Some spoke about their experience, many never did. The trauma of that confinement, the silence, the fear, the absolute helplessness, stayed with them for the rest of their lives. In 1967, a journalist named Anna Kowalska tracked down 12 of the surviving children, now adults, and interviewed them for an article about hidden rescues during the Holocaust. Her piece was published in a small Polish historical journal, read by a few academics, and then forgotten. The factory continued operating until 1989, when it finally closed for economic reasons. The building was eventually sold, converted into commercial space, renovated again. Today, it's a shopping center. There is no plaque marking where the Blue Gate once stood. No memorial to Rositsky, who died in 1959 without ever receiving official recognition for what he'd done. No indication that in this ordinary building, surrounded by shops and parking lots, 56 children once survived the impossible. But the survivors remember. And those who heard their stories remember. The Blue Gate is gone, but the proof of its existence walks the earth in the form of descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of people who were never supposed to survive. Families that exist because one engineer decided that empty space in a factory wall could be repurposed for hope. Stand today in what used to be the industrial district of Łódź, and you'll find no trace of Operation Blue Gate. The factory is a shopping center. The streets have been renamed. The people who walk past every day have no idea that beneath their feet, within these walls, 56 children once lived in a darkness measured by the rhythm of machinery. This is the paradox of hidden rescues. Their success depends on leaving no evidence. The best hiding places are the ones that disappear completely, erasing themselves so thoroughly that even decades later, historians struggle to prove they existed. And so the most successful rescue operations, the ones where everyone survived, where the secret held until liberation, are often the ones we know least about. What we know of Blue Gate comes from testimonies. From 12 survivors interviewed in 1967. From a single set of smuggled blueprints that Rosicki drew by hand and gave to a resistance member in 1944, blueprints that surfaced in an archive in Warsaw in 1983. From fragments of memory preserved by people who spent their childhoods in forced silence. These testimonies tell us facts, the dimensions of the chamber, the number of children, the duration of the hiding. But they can't fully convey what it meant to be 7 years old and told that your breathing must be quiet enough not to kill everyone around you. They can't capture the psychological weight of 9 months in darkness, the nightmares that followed liberation, the way those children struggled for the rest of their lives with enclosed spaces and sudden noises. Janina Kowalski, one of the survivors, said in her 1967 interview, "For years after the war, I couldn't sleep unless I heard machinery. Silence terrified me. I got a job in a factory just to be surrounded by that noise again. People thought I was crazy, but in silence, I could hear the Germans coming." Another survivor, David Rosenberg, the boy who survived emergency appendix surgery in the hidden chamber, became a doctor. He specialized in pediatric surgery and spent his career working with traumatized children. He never spoke publicly about Blue Gate, but his daughter found his journal after his death in 2003. One entry, written in 1979, said simply, "I became a doctor because Dr. Eisenberg proved that miracles are possible with shaking hands and 3 candles. I wanted to give that to other children, to be someone's impossible hope." The cost of Blue Gate wasn't paid only by the children. Rosicki lived the rest of his life with the memory of the 2 children who died in his chamber, the ones he couldn't save. Mrs. Kaminska, who held Sarah for months to prevent her from exposing everyone, struggled with the ethics of what she'd done, imprisoning a traumatized child to save others. The workers who smuggled food risked their families every day for 9 months. These weren't heroes who felt heroic. They were ordinary people who had made impossible choices and lived forever with the weight of them. And we must acknowledge the terrible mathematics of rescue. 54 children saved, while thousands perished. Blue Gate was extraordinary, but it was also exceptional. A combination of engineering knowledge, courage, luck, and circumstance that couldn't be replicated. For every hidden chamber that survived, there were dozens that were discovered, their inhabitants murdered, their rescuers executed. The Holocaust succeeded not because acts of resistance didn't happen, but because they were drops of water against an ocean of deliberate, systematic, industrialized murder.